Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Keith Hartley, the CEO of LevaData, and as you hear in the podcast from our discussion, a passionate surfer as well. Now, Keith has deep experience for helping manufacturing companies drive better decision-making through the use of data. He has deep domain knowledge in the procurement and supply chain software industry. Keith joined LevaData, who are a leading provider of AI-powered software enabling direct material sourcing and product development in late 2022, having previously led North American sales teams for iValue. In our conversation, we discussed the current state of direct material sourcing, how procurement and engineering teams can foster greater collaboration to the benefit of all sides, and how leading companies are using increased data visibility to differentiate their decision-making. This is something that we're really focused on at Art of Procurement as one of our pillars of 10x procurement. And if you listen to the show close enough, we even managed to sneak in some surfing references. Now, before we start, if you enjoy this conversation with Keith, we are partnering with LevaData to host a special 2-hour event on March the 15th. It's called Navigating the Decision Abyss, Managing Direct Spend in Chaotic Times. If that sounds interesting, just go to artofprocurement.com/calendar for a link to learn more. Or you can go to the show notes of today's episode, which is artofprocurement.com/podcast. Okay, so with all that said, let's go into the conversation where I started by asking Keith how he found himself in supply chain and manufacturing.
Yeah, I come from a manufacturing background. Actually, my dad was involved in the warehousing and transportation business long before they called it supply chain resiliency and supply chain efficiency, and terms like that were created. But my professional career, I've always spent in figuring out software solutions to problems. And the last 15 or 16 years have been spent primarily in manufacturing and supply chain, really trying to drive high efficiency solutions for manufacturers who are oftentimes one of the least served markets, if you think of where traditional B2B enterprise software targets. And I've just seen a tremendous growth in manufacturing, and of course, all things associative to supply chain certainly have been topical over the last 3 or 4 years. But I've been involved with manufacturing and helping manufacturers with data for about 15 years.
Right. No, it's really interesting. My background, very start of my career was in automotive. Probably spent a good 7 or 8 years in automotive. And what you say there about technology, it was very much an internal, we're using the technology we built internally, 25 years ago. And there wasn't a lot of innovation in the technology space supporting manufacturing supply chain, and how much that's changed over the last few years as you're starting to see more of a focus on that space.
Indeed. I think the time is now. Manufacturers, with the onset of kind of client server computing, there were some bespoke solutions throughout the factory floor and in the back office. And then, of course, with the onset of the internet and kind of thin client computing, the next revolution kind of happened, and manufacturing was still playing catch up. And I think now more and more business leaders are realizing that data and how you use data, whether it's in your supply chain or in your procurement function, is kind of key to driving efficiency. Otherwise, you're just guessing. Otherwise, you're doing things the way you've done them in the past and on historical record. And if we know nothing else, we know that the world shifts and the world changes frequently and violently. And in order for a modern manufacturer to stay relevant and to continue growing and producing a profit, they've really had to, in some ways, be forced to embrace data. And so I've certainly seen that playing in supply chain and procurement across different types of manufacturers.
And you joined LevaData, I think it was back in November of 2022. Right. Are those some of the observations that you're seeing as you speak to clients, prospects, just folks across the procurement and supply chain space within manufacturing?
Yeah, absolutely. Our problem statement is huge that we're addressing at LevaData. And if you think about it at the highest level, we're a data company. We
Mm-hmm.
help drive data insights, but just driving insights from data is relatively uninteresting. You have to be able to take action on
Yeah.
those insights. You have to know what specifically in manufacturing at the part level, how to triage that situation, how to pay less for the same quality, how to
Mm-hmm.
have a supplier diversity initiative at the part level. And so manufacturing in and of itself has a real data problem. It's not just a big data problem, it's a big contextualized data problem. And what I mean by that is a lot of the data that is being produced in modern manufacturers is not being collected. And even if it's being collected, the manufacturers don't have the ability to contextualize that data, to turn 30 languages into one language so that they can see what's going on part by part, bill of material by BOM, so that they can make corrective decisions and get ahead of supply chain disruptions. So
Yeah.
at LevaData, when I joined the company, that's what I really saw, which was a big problem statement. And we're driving the types of users that have historically sat in supply chain planning together with another function, which is the direct materials sourcing people.
Mm-hmm.
So actually driving collaboration and using data as the common language that these two functions talk about.
Yeah, because so often those organizations operate in silos, and you get a design function who will design a bill of materials without necessarily understanding or considering the commercial impact of the decisions that they're making. It gets to procurement or purchasing, depending on kind of the nomenclature, and there's not a lot you can do with it because it's kind of already designed in. It's really interesting you talk about the data and the importance of actually not just gathering the data, but it's the actions that you take. We talk all the time around the importance of using data to drive a differentiated decision making. So what we mean by that is it's not just one thing to gather it all. So gathering the information, synthesizing the information is important, but how are the decisions that you're going to make different with that information that you have? Because if you're not going to make different decisions, why are you trying to get the data? But if you're using the data to drive different decisions, that's kind of where the competitive advantage comes from.
Correct. And I think what I have witnessed is, manufacturing people are very smart. And the first iteration to solve this data problem was hiring a bunch of really bright PhD level data scientists and saying,
Mm,
make us more efficient. And the data scientists came in and said, we're observing 3% of the data and we don't know where to make different decisions. We can try a few things, but it's not fact based. We're just guessing. Kind of the second iteration of this revolution has been in house development. And what a
mm,
lot of large leading manufacturers realized is they're not software developers. You have to have the data chops to really swim into these waters. And so we at our core are data people who are applying that knowledge at the behest of manufacturers. And we
mhm.
know enough about manufacturing and we learn from every manufacturing client that we have. But this is a big data problem and it's a workflow issue that today remains largely offline and broken and disparate and disjointed at manufacturing companies. And
Mhm.
we're trying to solve that big data problem by blending different data types and contextualizing information. And when you have those insights, then take action on them. You have to
Yeah.
close the loop and be able to take action against the problems that you uncover.
Now, I have to ask you this. When I was doing some research into the podcast, I noticed that surfing was a theme that came up with some regularity. And then for anybody who's watching the video, you'll be able to see a surfboard right behind you and a picture of, an ocean.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me more about surfing and kind of how some of the lessons. We're a procurement podcast after all, so we always like to connect this ultimately with procurement. What are some of the things on the surfboard that you kind of take into the day-to-day job?
Yeah, that's yeah. My background kind of gives it away, doesn't it? I'm from Wisconsin, and so I took up surfing later in life. And to me, I love surfing. Surfing is the ultimate Darwinian sport. Either you can do it or you can't do it. You can't fake it on a wave. And I love the competitive aspect of surfing, and sort of the element and the mantra that you never arrive. You're always in search of a better wave, a better ride, a better experience. And for me, I love the learning aspect of surfing. It's humbling, it grounds you, and it's really about learning to be better and do better every single time I go out there. So I'm pretty passionate.
I'm definitely on the side of the ones that can't do it. I don't think I would last more than a second, but always marveling those that can.
Yeah, well, and there are a lot of lessons that I take away from surfing. I mean, surfing's a fun sport and a recreational sport, but the notion of perpetual learning from everything we do, being goal oriented, striving to achieve those goals. There's a lot of parallels to surfing and being in the software business. A couple others, you have to put in the work. You can't fake it. Yeah, it is Darwinian. You have to put in the work every single day, like we do at LevaData. And I think remaining humble, learning from your mistakes, and continuing that hard work ethic with humility is really how I feel about my surfing journey, but really how I feel about LevaData and the work that we do for our clients. There's a humility to what we do because we are helping our customers solve a problem that has been unsolvable for decades. It's a really hard problem statement that we are attacking to help our manufacturing clients.
And so I think that's otherwise I could start talking about running and data as well, and how data changes everything from a sports perspective. But I think it's a good segue back to supply chain. And of course, it's a little cliche of all the disruption that we see around us all the time over the last few years, and that's not getting any slower. What impact have you observed that's had on the direct material sourcing professionals that you're working with?
Yeah. I'd say it's twofold. Number one is people now are aware of what direct material sourcing is. I'd say it's sort of been a quiet profession, one that is a bit in the shadows from most supply chain folks and perhaps even some business folks. I mean, if you think about direct material sourcing, if a company cannot purchase enough material or parts to have a product, you can't generate revenue. So at its simplest form, the direct material sourcing profession, it has a profound impact on a manufacturer's ability to generate profit. So while manufacturers report EBITDA and COGS and nice fancy financial metrics, if the sourcing people don't have the right parts at the right place at the right time, there is no revenue. So I think that is on one hand, I've seen that there's been an increasing aperture on the function and the criticality of it. The second is, where does supply chain end and procurement begins? On the indirect material side, it's pretty simple. But on the direct material side, it gets a little more complex because of the constituents that are at play. There are engineers working in PLM systems, creating bills of material for new products or existing products that have to integrate with a part master inventory database, oftentimes housed in an ERP system. And they have to somehow rationalize that data with what they are purchasing, how many they're purchasing at what price, and whether or not they're getting a good deal. And that's a really hard problem. And so the sourcing professional is under intense pressure from all sides, from the engineering team, from their own procurement team, from the supply chain team. Particularly with the onset of COVID, the supply chain team now cares about part level access and de-risking. It used to be supplier risk was at the supplier level. Now, if you are not risking at the part level, you run the risk of having incomplete work in progress products and not having a finished good to sell. So I've seen this disruption really impact sourcing professionals. They're more valued, they're more relevant, And with the right tools, they can drive incredible value for their companies.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear that you're seeing kind of the elevation of direct material sourcing professionals, because I think there's always been this assumption pre-COVID that things will just show up. And if they don't show up, that's the time to point the fingers at procurement and have procurement to shout at the supplier. And I say that from experience, having had to have many of those conversations with, focusing out supply issues when they arise, but there was nothing really done proactively. And the focus was always on, there wasn't that much consideration of risk in the system. And because if you are going to de-risk, then that is ultimately typically going to come with a price. Whether that's a price of dual sourcing, whether it's a price of having to get multiple approvals with your client on being able to use a part in the end item, whatever it is, it comes with a cost. And there was not really that interest in bearing that cost from the business, which kind of ties procurement's hands. So it's interesting, you're now seeing that there's perhaps more of a risk mitigation appetite and a knowledge that an investment in risk is an investment that bears fruit.
Yeah, and I have a pretty hard take on risk. I think version 1 of risk is pretty well understood. It's supplier risk. Do you pay your bills on time? Do you deliver product in the quantities we order and the price we ordered? Was the quality good? Things like that. But if the modern manufacturer does not have a risk strategy at the part level, you run the risk of having incomplete products. So you could have a product, for example, a leading automobile manufacturer that has a little over 5,000 parts in one of their trucks was short 2 parts. And so they had a risk strategy at the supplier level, but not at the part level. And because of those 2 parts, they had fleets of trucks that were unable to ship. And it was just work in progress inventory that was caught on their balance sheet, and they were not able to get out there and sell those trucks and turn that into money, which drives EBITDA and revenue. So it's when you think about the problem, if you don't have a risk-adjusted strategy at the specific part level, you're really still having a risky supply chain.
Now, when we talked a little bit before about data and decision making, when folks are making decisions, which supplier to use, what pricing is good, what amount of risk to carry in the supply chain, how are they deciding what's good enough? Like, how are they baselining and benchmarking? This is what we should strive to. This is what we're comfortable with. And this is not going to put us at a competitive disadvantage because of a decision that we might make.
Yeah, it's in the old way of doing things, it was best guess and should cost. And let's just hope that we can get 10% more from our suppliers across the board, and maybe we can make the financials work. The modern manufacturer today is really faced with, something that I call the decision abyss. So you have this direct materials sourcing team with their inputs and pressures from people like engineers and commodity managers and product teams. And on the other side of the abyss, you have kind of the supply chain function, kind of well-known supply chain planning, supply chain execution, supply chain commerce. And this decision abyss exists when the direct materials side says, hey, how do we help with supply chain resiliency? How do we get insight into future production expectations? And the supply chain side is wondering, how do we accurately know what parts we can even get? And how do we know if we have enough supplier capacity onboarded to deliver the parts we think we can build? So this decision abyss concept that sits between these two functions is really where LevaData is focused on. It's about the data and a common language to let these teams that in the past, there's been a wall between them. And there's been an assumption that in good times, we can get every part at whatever price we got last year, maybe a little bit better. And we'll be able to easily warehouse, transport, and apply a labor factor to and get those parts where we need them. Now in the new world with variable warehousing and transportation costs and increased labor costs, you're seeing this notion of smart buying start to emerge. So this decision abyss between these two parties really is about making a better decision. Instead of buying 200 of something when you need 100, try to buy 105 and
Yeah.
buy them smartly. And of course, that's driven, initiatives like nearshoring, which has been around as long as I am old, and driving, closer parts to the actual factory types of initiatives. So the direct material sourcing function is undergoing a quiet, albeit pronounced renaissance right now for most large manufacturing companies.
So it requires collaboration across organization. When you think about, these themes are things that procurement, purchasing teams, that supply chain teams recognize the importance of, and perhaps historically they may have struggled in beginning to influence non-procurement supply chain teams, whether that's technical, engineering, teams like that. Is that on procurement and purchasing and supply chain to influence non-procurement supply chain teams in terms of the importance of this data and thinking differently? Or are you seeing that those changes in culture are being driven from above? So, the engineering teams recognize the importance of this now, whereas they didn't before, and they're figuring out, okay, how do I actually get my arms around this?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think there's a growing acknowledgement that we have to be smarter about this, we being a collective people that care about production for a manufacturer. But I think it's a nuanced question, because there are workflow issues that are highly offline and sort of bespoke, and something's on someone's laptop and something's on a Google sheet and something else is up in some data blob somewhere. And there's that notion of replacing kind of offline systems. Then there's the human aspect of training people to really be data first. And that's a change management issue. That takes some time. And so we at LevaData believe in kind of a crawl, walk, run scenario where we load parts, we train, and we continue to grow spend under management over time. And it quickly accelerates when people see the power of information, how to make better insights. And, there's a lot of market insights out there. There are lots of data sources that a sourcing professional can purchase and look at. But if you're looking at 1, 2, or even 10 sources, you're not getting enough information to know if you're making a smart decision at the part level. One other thing that's slightly tangential, Phil, is we're seeing a real move towards visibility. And in supply chain circles, the term visibility has been around for a long time. It's basically seeing contextualized data. And in procurement, visibility really cuts across operating units or divisions. So, for example, we see companies that will be buying the same part from the same supplier in 5 different divisions. Each division is paying a different price.
Yep.
One division is paying 2.5 times what another division is. And so just lighting up visibility of this data is a huge awareness factor in changing the culture of how a sourcing person uses data. And not to mention just benchmarking it at an average rate where you can immediately find cost savings. So the procurement professional in direct materials is not used to having access to that type of tool. So it's part iterating on the workflow. It's also part change management for the professional to really think about data first.
Yeah, I've had examples in my past where what you spoke of there in terms of we use it in 5 different places, 5 different prices, but also you have cost breakdowns, and you've asked for cost breakdowns for those 5 different components that have come in and been completed by 5 different salespeople, for example. And those cost breakdowns bear no resemblance to each other. And so that level of granularity of information allows you to be very, very targeted at opportunities. And that may uncover opportunities that are leverage-based and just information-based, insight-based, to say, well, this shouldn't be, and therefore you've kind of been caught. Or it can be, well, actually over here where we provide it there, we do something a little bit differently. And these are the things that we do a little bit differently. So those are what drive the cost. And so it's more of a kind of the value engineering cost side of things where the opportunity is, as opposed to a direct leverage.
Yes, agree.
Now, I want to talk a little bit in the time that we have remaining about kind of your view on the economy. And we're recording this, beginning of February of 2023. And we hear lots of different kind of news. Certain elements of the news are probably over amplified in terms of saying this is what the healthy economy is versus others. As a CEO and somebody who's talking to CEOs and CPOs and heads of supply chain across a number of different organizations, what's your perspective right now on the general economic landscape?
I'm moderately bullish, if I had to encapsulate that. Look, I've lived through a few markets that have gone up and down. My view is that this is a quick down, and then it's going to be slow, steady growth. But at the end of the day, manufacturers have to keep manufacturing. They have to keep producing goods. So every penny that you can save on a product, every risk mitigation effort towards a part level, the ROI is massive. So I'm very optimistic. We've actually seen a significant increase, maybe 3x, maybe 4x in the number of outreach and conversations that we engage with, because the workflow that we're going after, this decision abyss, is so critical for manufacturers. And they're also waking up to the fact that this is a problem, and they don't have a good formulaic way to go after the problem. And that is the data contextualization and making better decisions. So I am optimistic about the landscape. One of the trends I see, and something that we're mirroring at LevaData, is being able to kind of crawl, walk, run with customers. So starting small, beginning the change management process, because with most software projects, the real cost over time is in the change management. It's not in the licensing of the software or the implementation. And so I take that very seriously, because my job as a CEO is to find raving fans of LevaData. And so taking them on a crawl, then letting them walk, and then unleashing them to run with that kind of deployment is in our DNA here at LevaData. So I've definitely seen the market respond to that versus the old way of saying it's a big, wide, enterprise B2B project that'll take 10 years to get any kind of ROI.
And I want to come back to a question around the economy in a minute, but I do want to just jump on that. What does crawl look like for a manufacturer? Is it a select business division? Is it a select program? It's kind of, where would you start if you're thinking about, I really want to transform the way that I'm managing the communications across our teams, and then driving, more this contextualized data visibility that we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's my belief that we know more information about a specific part than anybody else on the planet. And we contextualize more data and have more relevant insights part by part by part. So when we go in and work with a client, we typically ask for product families, a grouping of parts, a grouping of people that we start with. We feed into our aperture, and then we scale out from there. So it's usually a subset of components or parts or key products that they're bringing to market where they don't have good visibility into what they should be paying, or what the market is paying. Oftentimes, we light up a customer and have relevant, actionable data on a small subset of parts within 60 days. And being around enterprise B2B software as long as I have, usually supply chain projects are measured in years in terms of go live and change management, things like that. We do that in a fraction of the time, and then build out the amount of parts or commodities, material, resins, metals. We build that into our aperture over time. And usually the client is pushing us to go even faster. Once they see, 5,000 parts, they're like, we want to add 50 more, and let's go. The insights on those, they become converts to LevaData pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think what you said around understanding what the market is paying is something that's really it's critical from an organizational perspective, but also from a purchasing or procurement perspective, because I think one of the challenges that we have in demonstrating the ROI of the investment in procurement is, what would the price be of this if I weren't paying you, procurement or purchasing, to negotiate it? And we don't have the answer to that a lot of times. Right. And so, we use procurement math as a way of demonstrating what we believe is the value of investing in procurement and our worth to the organization. But there's a disconnect then between the CFO, who doesn't necessarily see that showing up on the bottom line or can't necessarily trust the data. So having that data so you can truly say, this is the impact that we're having. And perhaps if it's when you're starting out, there's an opportunity to close that gap. It gives you something that's real and tangible to actually close against, as opposed to not really knowing, but thinking we do a good job because we get 3% year-on-year cost reduction.
I love that term, procurement math, because a lot of direct materials procurement organizations look at their historicals. Yeah. And they think if we can get a 3% savings, we're winning. They don't know, and they don't have access to information that tells them they might already be paying 15% over the market at a part level. And then once you identify that, how do I find another supplier that manufactures that part, or a CM, a contract manufacturer who does that part? And then what can I source for what price at the quality that I want that meets all the attributes that I need of that particular part? That's why we're so passionate about parts.
Yeah, and the damage on the other side is you may be paying 10 or 15% lower than market, but you're going back to that supplier every year and still trying to, I don't use the word lightly, but beating them up because you're needing to show that you're getting another 3% reduction, and they're coming back and say, I've got nothing left to give, and you're not necessarily trusting that. And so you're damaging those relationships where you actually have the most competitive advantage because of the commercial relationship that they have with you, and you're not being able to identify that.
Yeah, I see it as a two-way. I mean, look, to build real resilient supply chains, you have to have a resilient direct material sourcing function. And that's a combination of people and technology. And if you don't know what the market's paid, or you're licensing a data source or 6 data sources, you're not looking at enough information at the part or component level or ingredient level. That's our fundamental belief. So we're in the data business, and as much data as we can find, we absorb and contextualize, and believe that gives us more insights at an individual part or ingredient level.
Now, from a change management perspective, I want to ask about kind of your approach to when this information is presented. This information is presented because you've been working with a company for a client for 3 months or 6 months, or maybe in some part of due diligence. There's always a fear on the internal teams that this information isn't going to paint them in a good light because it's going to show opportunity and they're going to take that personally. How do you help companies overcome that kind of resistance to knowing the real story because they're afraid of what that might say about what they've done in the past?
Yeah, there's precedent for fear anytime data is applied to an industry. You can look at an ERP industry or an HR vertical and look at how, when data came along, does it expose people or does it actually empower them and their job function? I'm a belief in the latter. It actually, there is an immediate wow factor. But usually then those sourcing agents, commodity managers, direct material, global commodity managers, they're unleashed with this data to then go take action. And again, my thesis with LevaData is it's all about taking action. So if all we do is produce dashboards, which some companies can do, it's not enough. You have to guide the sourcing professional on decisions or actions that they can take. And then they may or may not take those actions. There might be a good reason to pay a supplier a little bit more. You might have some other things going with them, in terms of buying other parts or new product, joint innovation. But fundamentally, I have not seen data be a deterrent to the sourcing professional. It has empowered them. It has unleashed them. So we definitely go in with that as an open mindset. But there is certainly, I want to acknowledge that fear and concern. Anytime you light up data that relates to someone's job function. There's
Right.
little fear and uncertainty about that.
Yeah, and I like to try and encourage folks that it's not that you've not been doing your job. You didn't have access to the tools that
That's
provided
right.
you with the insights to make these decisions. So look at it as an opportunity to actually have access to something you didn't have before. And it's about what you do with it, as opposed to looking at it as a fear that it's going to show that, when you said you had the best prices in the world for something, that perhaps you didn't.
Yeah, the customer example that I spoke about where one division had an incredibly low part price relative to the market. So
Mhm.
you also see signs of where some customers have negotiated really good deals and have good terms at that part level. But again, I have not seen technology remove procurement people or replace procurement people, because the gold is in the action. So taking
Mhm.
that relevant contextualized data and taking action, that requires humans. And taking that action is what the sourcing professional is really paid for. Help improve us 300 basis points this quarter.
Yeah.
Go find cost savings. And so we help them achieve the goal that they're tasked with. So usually, all the time, we're not at odds. We just light up the data and then help them understand that and make better decisions.
Yeah, you talk about cost savings again. It's really interesting because you look at the historically, the goal of procurement. Well, not the goal. It's you're either in cost cutting mode or relationship building mode,
Mm.
and those things were never done at the same time. It was one to the detriment of the other, and we call it kind of the hamster wheel of cost. Cut costs at all costs. You upset everybody. You burn a lot of relationships. Then the business cycle changes, and then it's all about constrained supply in the market. We need to be a customer of choice. So we do different things. We leave money on the table. Business cycle changes. Those people get let go because they left money on the table and the cost cutters come in. How are you seeing with data visibility that procurement teams can have both, or they don't need to only focus on one versus the other? There's still the relationship to be maintained as opposed to just going after driving and cutting costs at all costs.
Yeah, if you think about the procurement role, they buy stuff, right? They're buyers. We're giving them a tool to actually be better negotiators. So actually having the data to, in some cases, cut cost, in other cases, solve for risk, in other part cases, solve for availability, in some cases, solving for lead time and end of life concerns about particular parts. Quite frankly, I don't know how a direct material sourcing person can do their job without access to this completely and
Mhm.
wholly, because otherwise you know a little bit and you're guessing a lot. And
Yeah.
so my hat's off to the function and people that have been in direct material sourcing and dealing with supply chain and engineering and product teams and finance teams. It's a really hard job. And so I take great pride and passion in helping that market, helping that underserved market, because there are not other tools in the market that can help them be better at achieving their goals.
Mhm.
They're underserved, and now that the flashlight is on them, given all of the things going in the world between COVID and supply risk because of war and other, a potential looming recession, now is the time for those procurement professionals to act and step into the light, to help their companies be more profitable and be better manufacturers.
Mhm. Now we've talked a lot through the conversation around and we did just there around cost savings versus relationships. It's all about balance and maintaining balance. So I think that I don't want to wrap this podcast up without coming back to surfing. And just talking about stance and balance. Are there things that companies can make, that procurement supply chain professionals can make to maintain that balance, but while still maintaining control?
Yeah, it's balance and control is everything, in surfing and in life. Another great parallel between surfing and sales. But look, I think that there are small adjustments, and I would
Mhm.
say the first one is an acknowledgement that this working function, direct materials sourcing, is not equipped with enough data and insights to take fact-based action. So just acknowledging that, understanding those words leads very smart people down a road of discovery, meaning what can help us do our job? What is our job? What does our function mean to the company and to others around us, like supply chain planners? And so I think just that admission that we want to be a data-driven company, we want to start small, prove it, and grow out. I think those are, while some would call those small adjustments, I would say those can be groundbreaking and game-changing for today's manufacturers. So I think those are two: to maintain balance and control, keeping your existing supplier relationships, your existing part relationships, but applying the aperture of a real well-constructed data model that contextualizes all of this data and kind of allows you to have a system to track how you're doing over time, to be alerted to supply chain disruptions at the part level, and to actually take control of the job. Much more of a proactive stance and balance, getting on the front foot of the function instead of being on your heels and playing defense as people are throwing things your way. So, those are small adjustments that I would invite anyone to make in the sourcing, direct materials procurement space, is to really look hard at how you use data to drive your insights and then, of course, resulting action.
Now, as I think about professionals in the direct material sourcing space, it's an exciting time to get the visibility into this information that we always wished for, but could never actually get our hands on, or the information that we would try and get our hands on would immediately get rejected by suppliers as not being accurate, and you have nowhere to go from that. So I want to thank you so much, Keith, for your time and for sharing some of the benefits of your experience and your insights with our community today. I have one last question, and I always say this is the easy question. That is, if anybody would like to learn a little bit more about what you do at LevaData, or just connect with you directly, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Best place would be to find me on LinkedIn, Keith Hartley, LevaData, and also our website, www.levadata.com. Please come learn more. We oftentimes meet with clients in the first meeting, and they give us a few parts, and we show them the types of insights that we can drive and deliver. So I would make that offer to your listening community, that we are at the ready, and have us help you get better part level data and get started today. So thank you very much, Phil.
All right. Well, thank you so much. What I'm going to do is I'll include those links in the show notes for today's episode. All of the show notes for all of our podcasts are at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. And Keith, one last time, thank you so much for joining me. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.